Welcome back to the Conservation Cooperative, a production of the New England and New York chapters of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. I'm Chris, and today we are going to explore chronic wasting disease preparedness and prevention in the Northeast. As you might know, the Northeast is currently the last CWD-free region in the country. We'll hear from experts in zoonotic disease and learn some of the ways that state agencies and BHA are working to protect our wild deer herds and quite possibly the future of deer hunting and conservation as we know it in the Northeast. I figured we'd eventually cover CWD on an episode of Conservation Cooperative, but being honest, I was in no particular rush. There's just a lot of really interesting topics to cover. But then, at a recent Massachusetts public hearing regarding regulations that were intended to reduce the risk of the spread of CWD, I heard a few comments from people that weren't too far off from what I've heard through my work in other parts of the country. To be generous, I kind of categorize these ideas as being a little fringe, or at least not in line with the current scientific realities. So here we are. I need 2 minutes to make sure we're all on the same page. Chronic wasting disease, or CWD, is part of a family of rare, fatal neurodegenerative diseases called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, or TSCs, all caused by misfolded proteins known as prions. These prion diseases affect many animals, but CWD is specific to cervids, things like deer, elk, and moose. More widely known TSCs include Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, also known as mad cow disease, and scrapies in sheep and goats. It should be noted that unlike bacteria or most viruses, prions are nearly impossible to destroy. Once they're in the environment, they persist and are potentially infectious for years to come. First discovered in Colorado in 1967, CWD has been detected in 36 U.S. states and 5 Canadian provinces. It spreads through contact with infected bodily fluids or contaminated materials, has a long incubation period, and is deadly once symptoms appear. Infected animals can shed prions long before showing symptoms, making control tough, especially in close quarters like farms. It's actually the captive cervid industry that is largely responsible for the spread of CWD through the movement of animals, sharing of equipment, and other factors. Thankfully, there have been no known cases of CWD in humans, either from exposure to contaminated materials or through consuming infected animals. New York detected CWD in captive and wild deer in 2005, but were successful in stopping any additional spread. Since that time, and in over 65,000 tests of wild deer, there wasn't a detection until October 2024, when a sample tested positive from a captive deer facility in southern Herkimer County.
One constant that I like to say for CWD is that it always gets worse.
Meet Dr. Krysten Schuler, a wildlife disease ecologist and the director of the Cornell Wildlife Health Lab. Dr. Schuler and her lab is highly regarded by wildlife professionals and has been a leader in providing resources to state agencies so they can be more effective at monitoring and responding to disease outbreaks in free-ranging animals.
So unfortunately, I think we're up to 36 states now that have detected CWD, and Georgia being the most recent to add to that list. In the Northeast, we're really fortunate that we haven't had as many affected states as some other areas of the country. So in the Northeast, obviously Pennsylvania is sort of the big one that's struggling with CWD the most. We had a case in New York just this past fall in a captive cervid herd. That herd was depopulated, and in the surveillance that we did in that area, didn't find any wild detections, but, gotta hold our breath for a couple of years till we feel more comfortable with that conclusion that we were able to get it early. So once you get up into New England, we're hopeful that we can kind of keep it at bay there.
As I alluded to in the beginning of the show, the public's understanding of CWD is complicated. First off, TSCs are very different than the pathogens that we're most familiar with. But in addition, in some parts of the country, CWD has been swept up by politics and culture wars, which makes the job of communicating the best available information by experts like Dr. Schuler even more challenging.
I started working with wildlife because I didn't really want to work with people. And so that has totally changed. And, throughout the course, I've been working on CWD since I was doing my PhD, like back in 2002. We always think that we really need to intensively study the animal, but it's really challenging because this is a confusing disease. It's not something that people are familiar with. And when you explain it to them, you know, really prions, these misfolded proteins that cause CWD are like the perfect pathogen. And so it kind of warps people's brains when they start asking questions about it. Like, well, how do you get rid of it? Can you cook the meat to get rid of it? Like, no, you can't do that. Like you basically, it almost sounds indestructible. And then the fact that there isn't any vaccine, there isn't any true genetic resistance, really just is sort of contrary to what we think of for most pathogens that are out there. And so the other part of this that I think is really hard for people to sort of come to grips with is that they don't see a lot of dead deer from it. So things like epizootic hemorrhagic disease, which we have now more, looks like it might be more frequently in the Northeast, people see a lot of dead deer. And so they can understand like, oh, I saw a dead deer or know somebody who saw a dead deer. And so like, obviously, there was a disease issue and it killed them. The fact that we don't see a lot of dead deer from CWD because it's such a long course of disease. And if you have holes in your brain, which is how, CWD was named with a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, you're not going to do as well. So you're more likely to be killed by a hunter or predator or hit by a car. So they don't see those sort of end stages of where the deer looks really sick, it's drooling, its ears are drooping. And even for me, I tested deer and I followed them around and tried to observe them every single day. I couldn't necessarily have picked out which deer had CWD because, I had a gigantic mule deer buck and it got killed by coyotes, maybe, or maybe it died. But by the time I got to it, it was scavenged. And I had seen that deer, all the time and never thought it was sick or anything. But I think, these minor sort of mental challenges, they're wild animals. They need all their faculties. So that's what sort of takes them out before we see those end stages.
Even in regions where chronic wasting disease is impacting the deer population, communicating the gravity of the issue to both the public and lawmakers can be daunting. Take North Dakota, for example, where CWD is a hot button topic. Even among hunters, a vocal minority doubts the very existence of prions responsible for the disease. With 17 to 18% of the population being hunters, one might assume that legislative committees would be somewhat familiar with CWD and its potential impact on deer populations and the hunting culture. In stark contrast, consider New Hampshire, a state with no reported CWD cases, nor in any neighboring states. Only about 5% of its residents hold hunting licenses, so it's quite possible that the lawmakers on relevant legislative committees have little personal connection to hunters, let alone an understanding of CWD. This lack of familiarity was evident at a recent hearing held by the New Hampshire legislature's House Fish and Game and Marine Resources Committee. The discussion addressed a bill proposing mandatory CWD testing for deer meat brought into New Hampshire by hunters who ventured out of state. As the committee questioned the bill's sponsor and the citizen advocating for the law, it became apparent that several legislators had no awareness or understanding of the disease. Fortunately, the head of the Wildlife Division for New Hampshire Fish and Game took the stand and was able to address some lingering questions. He was a skilled communicator and able to address technical questions, all while explaining in clear terms why the department did not support the bill. Dr. Schuler has seen this type of thing play out elsewhere.
Unfortunately, a lot of times politicians get involved. And so while the agencies folks understand the biology and the purpose of doing these things, politicians, are just getting angry calls and they want the angry calls to stop. So I think it really takes a lot of fortitude on the part of these agencies to say, this is the course that we're taking for disease management. And, we've got to take these actions to stop the disease for the long run. Because we think about while, natural resource agencies, their mandate is to protect these public trust assets, our wildlife, current and future generations' use.
We'll return to state agencies and the management actions in a bit, but let's stick to the policy side for a little while longer. Specifically, how BHA is engaging on these issues in New England and in New York.
I am Mike Woods. I currently serve as the chapter board chair for the New England chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. So I'm a volunteer, but I have my hands in things all over the region. I live in Rhode Island, which means that a lot of the work that I do on the ground and also in the policy realm is here in my home state. Over the last half decade or so, there have been regulatory and legislative proposals related to deer management and specifically related to chronic wasting disease and the management of chronic wasting disease. Primarily, what we are interested in here at the New England chapter is preventing the spread of CWD to this region. We are lucky right now in that it has never been detected here, which means that most of our state agencies are in a surveillance mode as opposed to a response mode, which, as we've seen in other parts of the country, can ramp up very quickly in terms of what it costs the agency, as well as sort of the complicated conversations that we have to have with hunters and in places where there is an agricultural deer industry with the farmers that own and manage those species. So right now we're lucky, and our goal here is to keep it that way by trying to keep CWD out of New England for as long as we can.
The New York and New England chapters have been collaborating with our agency partners to back various regulatory and statutory efforts aimed at preventing the introduction of CWD into our region. Since many states have already implemented regulations to minimize the risk of hunters accidentally bringing home infected deer carcasses, recent efforts have shifted the focus to the captive deer industry.
The biggest concern has to do with the captive deer farming and captive deer hunting industry, which there are concerns from a number of angles. There certainly are ethical concerns with hunting captive wildlife, but our focus primarily, at least when it comes to policymaking, has to do with the financial and then the ecological aspects of chronic wasting disease, which now at this point has been very closely linked to the movement of deer by that industry. So what we focus on in the policymaking realm is the regulation and the legislation surrounding captive facilities. And our ultimate goal, is to phase out and eliminate this industry in New England. Unfortunately, they have demonstrated in other parts of the country that even with the best management practices and the best of intentions, that right now we do not have the ability to prevent the spread of CWD to new areas.
One recent example unfolded in Mike's state of Rhode Island. It started in 2017 when a luxury sporting club in Richmond called the Preserve began exploring the idea of creating a high-fence, big-game hunting experience on its property for members. The club's chairman at the time made it known that he'd be interested in importing genetically altered whitetails and also elk and boar to the private club. There was a wrinkle with that plan, though. While it might have been possible to obtain the animals, it would be illegal to hunt them. So they introduced a bill in 2018 that would allow any shooting preserve with at least 500 acres to hunt animals other than domestic game birds.
When this came out, the conversations or the species that were part of the conversations were obviously white-tailed deer, which is a vector for chronic wasting disease, as well as other species like elk and wild boar or wild pigs, which are not CWD issue, but are very much an invasive species problem in other parts of our country. We're kind of surprised that anyone would even propose such a thing. in a place where it didn't exist, knowing the way that the industry has spread these negative ecological effects to other parts of the country. But nonetheless, we were faced with this proposal, and to put it bluntly, we opposed it.
The bill also caught the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management by surprise, which publicly voiced concerns, particularly around CWD. But given the financial resources and political connections the preserve had, there was a real risk of this bill moving through the legislature. Mike Woods and other members of the Rhode Island BHA team implemented an effective grassroots campaign that ultimately saw the bill fail. Despite the early success, they knew the fight was far from over. In 2019, BHA's strategy shifted from defense to offense, and the team submitted its own bill, one that would establish a statutory prohibition of the importation and hunting of cervids and other large game. Mike explains.
As the policy conversation moved forward, it shifted from, talking about establishing a new facility. Largely, this is at BHA's urging, but shifted the conversation to talking about a statutory prohibition on the captive hunting of big game animals and the importation of animals for that purpose. And the final outcome last year was that we were able to pass a law here in Rhode Island that would ensure that we did not get into the business of importing wildlife like deer and elk that could carry CWD, or pigs that could escape facilities and cause ecological damage on their own into the state of Rhode Island. And so it effectively has been addressed here.
From beginning to end here, we're talking about 7 years of work, finally culminating in the summer of 2024 when the bill became law. It was a huge win for Rhode Island and the deer herd of southern New England. This brings us back to the topic of educating lawmakers and the public. Rhode Island is much different than the example of New Hampshire mentioned earlier in the show. On average, Rhode Island has nearly 1,000 more people per square mile than New Hampshire does. Less than 1% of the population has a hunting license, and outdoor recreation is way different in the Ocean State than it is in the Granite State. So how did Rhode Island BHA convince lawmakers this necessitated their attention?
Here in Rhode Island, there were really 3 things that got that initiative, the statutory prohibition, across the finish line. The first of them was that science really supported the position that we brought to the legislature in advocating for not allowing the industry here. All of that research is showing that we should not be moving deer around to new places. We shouldn't be concentrating them. And so we had the science on our side. The second thing is the financial aspects. And one of the things that I made sure to demonstrate to lawmakers when I was talking with them is the sort of case study of what CWD introduction looks like in other states. And some states have been fairly open with the financial burdens that it's placed on their natural resource agency to transition from a surveillance sort of management regime into a response management regime where they're talking about collecting samples from as many deer as they possibly can, and the disposal of carcasses and all of the management practices that go into an area that has detected the disease and is now responding to it. Politicians tend to understand the dollars and cents pretty well. The third thing that got it across the finish line was the persistence of our members and the time that we put in to educate lawmakers, one-on-one in the halls of the State House. And it took us 5 or 6 years to get it across the finish line. But during that time, there were a lot of conversations had directly with lawmakers to take the time and really educate them, right? It wasn't just an email in the inbox from a copy paste kind of letter writing campaign. It was actual people that tracked them down and spent the time to teach them what was going on and make sure they really understood it. And when they did understand it, it was a no-brainer. And so that persistence, not only with this policy issue, but with any policy issue, is key to getting things across the finish line, especially when you're working within grassroots capacity like we do at Backcountry Hunters and Anglers.
Communicating science, connecting the economics, and staying persistent might not always be the precise ingredients for desirable policy outcomes. but they are certainly part of the recipe. One thing we all could benefit from in this effort is more engagement from the greater hunting community. Truthfully, there just aren't many voices on this issue in the Northeast. Understandably, it's complicated, and there are plenty of other things that seem to be front of mind for the average hunter. Fortunately, many of our state agencies have recognized the threat that CWD presents, not just for our deer herd, but our connection to these animals and the relevancy of hunting. And they're doing stuff about it. In part 2 of this episode, we're going to learn how different states are addressing this issue and the steps they're taking to be prepared for a potential shift from monitoring to responding to CWD. That and more next time. Thank you so much for listening. As I'm sure you are aware, there is a lot going on in the conservation world right now. Stay connected with us on social media. Both the New York and the New England chapters are regularly sharing information and updates on various policy and conservation news on Instagram. Of course, the best way to keep connected is become a member and get involved. You don't have to be a policy or a science guru. Everyone has something to offer our public lands, waters, and wildlife, and we need you now more than ever. Talk to you next time. Take care.